Good morning, Abundant Life Church. This is Pastor Chris. Today we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 2, verses 12 down through 17. Back in the 1980s, the Chicago Cubs had a third baseman by the name of Vance Law. Their first baseman was Mark Grace. And one announcer who had a good sense of humor and an interesting sense of theology once said during a Cubs game that most religions are like the Cubs shortstop and second baseman. They wind up somewhere between law and grace. All right, that's a good line. But is it good theology? It's always been a tenet of Paul's theology that we're saved by grace, not by the law, and not by our own goodness. It's God's goodness that saves us. It's what God did for us, not what we do for ourselves. Okay, and that has always been just an absolute with Paul, which makes this passage today look rather confusing. In today's passage, Paul condemns those who thought they were automatically righteous in God's eyes simply because they kept the law, but they weren't necessarily keeping the law. Now, he meant people like that would not be saved. If you say you're keeping the law, but you're not really doing it, you actually have to obey the law for it to save you. Hey, what? The law saves us? You see, by saying that, we have to ask, does Paul mean that those who did keep the law and did do a good job of it are going to be saved? So is it the law that saves us? Are we saved by our own goodness, our own obedience? But what about grace then? All right, what does all this mean? So let's look at the passage here and ask ourselves, did Paul think that this was how we're going to be judged, by how well we behave? Verses 12 and 13 say this: all who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. It is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Now, no Jew was opposed to the law. They all thought it was great. But there were some who figured they were okay with God simply because they were Jews. They were the chosen people. Sure, they agreed with the law, but they weren't really that active about actually keeping the law. And, hey, we're Jews. God is not going to not let us in. He's not going to let any Gentiles in, but he's not going to keep any Jews out. They're automatically righteous because they are God's chosen people. So did they need to be so strict when it came to living by the law day in and day out? We know we're going to be saved anyways. But Paul seems to be saying here, remember back in verse 11, he says God does not show favoritism. Paul is saying that God is not a respecter of person. That meant that thinking that you were okay with God just because you were a Jew isn't how it works after all. So it wasn't enough to just have the law. You actually have to keep the law, or it's not going to do any good for you. And Paul implied that keeping the law was in fact the standard that's going to be used on Judgment Day. I want to look again at verse 13, then I want to skip down to verse 16. Verse 13 says this: for it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Now look at verse 16. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secret through Jesus Christ, as my gospel decrees. The Jews had always just assumed they're going to be fine on Judgment Day, but Paul is saying, no, even if you are a Jew, if you haven't kept God's law, you're not going to make it. But you have to actually keep the law for it to save you. So the implication is here that it's the law that saves you, at least if you're a Jew. So apparently the way we are going to be saved, the way we are going to be judged, is based on how good we've been and how much we've stayed away from sin. Well, then what's the point of grace? How does grace work? Is grace even a thing? Haven't we been told that salvation is not based on what we've done, but on what Jesus did for us? Okay, but did God really mean that? Did he just say one thing and then change the whole system without telling us? Were we lied to about grace? You know, when I was in high school, I played a lot of different sports. I played football, I played basketball, I played baseball. One year, instead of basketball, I even wrestled. A lot of sports. Don't be impressed. I was terrible at all of them. I was equally bad at every single sport. Not an athlete. But every sport, the coach said the same thing. He gave us the big speech at the beginning of the season, first day of practice. He'd say, guys, I don't care how talented you are, I care how hard you work. If you don't show up for practice, I don't care who you are, you're not playing. They all said that. I'm sure they thought they meant it, but every coach did the same thing. The best players, if they missed practices, didn't have any impact, they still played. The worst players, us guys, if any of them skipped a practice, they wouldn't play. You say one thing, but you mean another. Paul has implied through all his letters that we're saved by grace, not works. It's not, our salvation isn't based on what we do, it's what God has done for us. This passage almost seems to contradict that. Why does it? Well, we'll talk about that next time. Till then, have a great day.